Thank you, Brother John. We all felt a very special presence as he prayed just now, and I trust that that presence would continue even into this word. And needless to say, this is the time of the year that when we think about life, the meaning of life, the reality of life, and the commitments that we must make in order to live the next 360 plus years, if our lives are spared, effectively. I like the word effectively because there are different ways that we can live, and we're not always living effectively. It is at this time of the year that I like to reread that book by Stephen Covey. It's called The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. If you've never read that book, if it's not one of in your collection, it is highly recommended. It is one that I like to reread in January because it kind of reframes and resets the heart as we look to a brand new year. And in Stephen Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, habit number 2 is the title to my message. It is Begin with the End in Mind. Begin with the end in mind. What does Stephen Covey mean by begin with the end in mind? Well, it's living life with a clear mental picture of what the end is supposed to be as you envision the end, what you want the end to be, how you want to finish, and how you want to finish well. And in the chapter where he deals with this particular habit too, he invites the reader into a mental picture. Let's just close our eyes and mentally picture ourselves on our way to a funeral. We're driving to the funeral parlor, to the chapel, to the church, and we get to the parking lot and we see all these people on their way in and faces we haven't seen in a long time. And we're just delighted to see these people, even though sad for the occasion. And we go on in and we hear the soft music in the background and all the little cluster of people and the low chatter, and the viewing is taking place. And then we realize, oh, they're getting ready to close the casket. I better get down there. And there's a little clearing. Here's my chance. And so I go down to the front of the church where the casket is. And I stand to look into the casket, and suddenly I am face to face with myself. My goodness. This is my funeral. 3 years from now, or 5 years from now, or who knows, 20 years from now, maybe tomorrow. But this is my funeral. I'm at my funeral. And I'm sobered by that. So I go back and I sit down. I can't imagine. I'm at my funeral and I look down at the bulletin that's in my hand, the program that they handed me when I arrived. And I begin to observe that there are going to be 4 speakers at my funeral. 4 people will be speaking in the next few moments at my funeral. The first person up to speak will be a close relative, somebody who really knows me well, who's lived in my home, part of my family. They've seen me in my underwears at night, they know me really well. And the second is a friend, a close friend. Didn't live in my home, but we grew a friendship over the years, and I've shared lots of confidences. They know me really well. And the third person is a worker, somebody from my job, my profession. And then number 4, somebody from my local church or my community, somebody from that outer sphere, that circle with whom I did life together. And Covey says, as I sit there now thinking about the service about to start and these 4 people who are going to speak, the question that must confront us, the question we must answer is, what would you want them to say? What would you want them not to say? What are you worried about that they might say that you don't want them to say? You know, you've heard the story of the 2 brothers who they were members of the church. They were very rich, but they were very bad. They were wicked. Not sure why they were a part of the church, but they were a part of the church, and they were very, very, you know, they bribed people all the time, and suddenly the younger brother died, and the older brother came to the pastor and he said, look, here's an envelope. You have this building fund, you know, you're going to build a new sanctuary, and we're trying to raise money. He says, hey, I've got all the money you need in this envelope, the check to cover the entire building program. I'm only asking one favor. When you get up, I want you to tell the people that my baby brother was a saint. And you have all the money. The preacher took the envelope because he couldn't resist. I mean, he felt like this was an answer to prayer. And so he deposited the check before the service. Then he got to the church and they had the funeral service. And when it was time to speak, he knew he couldn't lie. He got up and he had an idea. He said, folks, I want to tell you, this deceased, this dearly departed here, he said, he was wicked. He was a crook to the core. He was vile. But compared to his older brother, he was a saint. To avoid people having to make things up at our funeral, we need to live our lives in such a way, we need to decide what we would want them to say, and then live our lives in such a way that they'll say it. And that when they say it, it'll be true. It'll be true. And how do we do that? How do we do that? Hebrews chapter 12 is where I want us to go for a minute. If you have your Bible, turn to Hebrews 12. And the first 3 verses of Hebrews 12, the author begins, therefore. And whenever you see the word therefore, you're supposed to stop and figure out what it's there for. And it's there because of everything the author has just said in chapter 11. And what did the author say in chapter 11? He went down this list. He took us through this hall of faith. All these people who have died, but who lived their lives in an exemplary way, that they made it into the hall of fame or the hall of faith. Now in chapter 12, he says, since we are surrounded by such great a cloud of witnesses, and a lot of Christians understand that all those dead people, you know, they're up in heaven somewhere, looking down. That's the cloud of witness. We don't believe in that theology, but we can still believe. We can still believe. They may not be looking down from heaven, but their spirits, the lives they lived, the testimonies they had, still bear witness. We are surrounded by the witness of Uncle Ralph and Aunt Erlene and all the people that we have buried. And we since we are surrounded by their hopes and dreams for us, let us lay aside every weight and the sin that so easily ensnares us, And let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking unto Jesus, the author and the finisher of our faith, who, for the joy set before him, endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Brothers and sisters, ladies and gentlemen, here in this room and those on Zoom, everybody listen up. There is a race. We're in a race. As Christians, we are in a race. Whether we want to be in the race or not, we're in a race. That's just the way it is. That's the way God set it up. We're in a race. And the goal is to finish the race, but not just to finish the race, but to finish how? To finish well, to finish well. The story of the runner who was at the Olympics. He came from Tanzania and he was in the race. He was a great runner, but somehow that day he wasn't clicking and the people kept passing him, and suddenly he was the lagging behind. He was the last one. And somebody hit the tape way up front. And they were cheering, and then this guy way, way back, he just kept running, and he wouldn't quit running, and he kept running long after the race was over. He just kept running, and finally he got up to the tape, and somebody said, the reporter said, "Why did you keep running when you knew you could see clearly from way back there the race was over?" He says, "It's simple. I kept running because the people of Tanzania did not send me to the Olympics to not finish." Today, we are reminded that Jesus didn't redeem us to not finish. Jesus didn't save us to stop halfway in the race. We must finish. We must finish well. And how do we finish well? How do we begin now with the end in mind? Well, a couple of things I want to point out in Hebrews 12. Number one, there is a race set before us. And notice how the author says it. Let us run with endurance the race set before us. Newer translations say the race marked out for us. It means that we're not running all in the same way, that I may have a 100-meter dash, that you may have a 400, you may have a, we all have our individual race marked out for us. The race set before us. Secondly, we are to run the race with endurance. With endurance. Let us run with endurance. The word endurance comes from, it's an interesting word in the Greek language. It's a double compound word. It's made up of two words. One is hypo, and one is mounce, hypomons, M-O-U-N-C-E. Hypo means under, and mounce means to abide. So hypomounce is to abide under something, to abide under. That is what it means to endure. And New Testament writers often don't know what to make of this word. And so you'll find in some places the word endurance. You'll find in some places the word persevere. You'll find in some places the word patience. In Hebrews 12, verse 1, it says, run with patience. Some places it says, run with perseverance. Some places run with endurance. Whatever it is hypomons. Run in a way that you are abiding under. You're abiding under. It reminds me of Psalm 91. We just read from Psalm 90. In Psalm 91, the psalmist says, he who dwells in the secret place of the Most High shall abide under, there it is, shall hypomons under the shadow of the Almighty. And what that helps us understand is that to endure is not just to tough something out. It's not, enduring is more than, well, I'm hanging in there. I'm trying to make it. No. To abide under is to understand what the end goal is and to run with vigor and vitality toward the finish line. There is a race to be run. We're supposed to run with endurance. And then number 3, as we run, we are supposed to fix our eyes on the finish line. And the person down at the finish line, his name is Jesus Christ. Fixing our eyes on Jesus. I wonder why the author is suggesting that we fix our eyes on Jesus. There are 3 reasons that we need to fix our eyes on Jesus. First, because he is our best example of endurance. He's our best example of endurance. Jesus, it says, for he endured the cross and he despised the shame. Eugene Peterson in the Message says, because he never lost sight of where he was headed, because Jesus never lost sight of where he was going, he was able to deal with anything. He was able to handle anything. He was able to handle the cross. He was able to handle the shame of the cross because he had his eyes on the Father. He is the best example of endurance. He had focus. It says, for the joy set before him, he endured the cross. He had the end in mind. He wasn't just focused on the now. He was dealing with the now. He was living in the now, very much so. He was enduring the cross. But because of the joy set before him, the joy of where he knew this would end up, he was able to deal effectively with what was going on in the now. For the joy set before him, for the joy of it all. We fix our eyes on Jesus because he's our best example of endurance. Number 2, because he is waiting for us at the finish line. That's why we fix our eyes on him. He says that Jesus is the author and the finisher of our faith. As Christians, we don't have a problem believing that Jesus Christ is the beginner of our faith, the author of our faith. But we often forget that he is the finisher of our faith. He's not only there at the beginning with the starting gun, he's at the end with the wreath, with the goal, with the trophy. He's going to be there at the end saying, welcome home, come on in. Well done, thou good and faithful servant. He's the beginner. He's the author. He's the Alpha. He's the ending. He's the Omega. He's the finisher. It is Jesus all the way. And the third reason we fix our eyes on Jesus, he's our best example of endurance. He's the one going to be at the finish line. But thirdly, and very importantly, ultimately, it is what he has to say when we get to the finish line that's most important. We started out with Stephen Covey talking about what the people are going to say at our funeral. And I hope when I go that somebody will get up and say something positive at my funeral. But ultimately, it's not what they say at my funeral that's going to be most important. It's going to be what Jesus says when I stand before him. I want to hear him say to me, well done, thou good and faithful servant. To hear him say, well done. Michael English used to sing, you know, I I dreamed of a place called heaven. And he talks about going and being with, looking up Peter and looking up John and looking up all the Apostle Paul and Abraham and Isaac and Mark, Luke and Timothy. But all he says, I want to see Jesus because he's the one who died for me. And to stand before Jesus and to hear him say to me, well done, thou good and faithful servant. That is the ultimate goal. That is the ultimate goal. Therefore, since we are surrounded by such great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside, the author says. Since we're beginning with the end in mind, since we're looking at the finish line, since we want to finish well, what do we do now? Well, let us lay aside every weight, everything that weighs us down. And brothers and sisters, you and I know there is so much in this world to weigh us down. Let us lay aside every weight. And if you understand Greek culture, you know that one of the reasons why in a lot of pictures, a lot of Greek statues of runners, they're naked. That's not for, lewd purposes. That's portraying the Greeks were so determined to run with all their weight set aside that usually they ran naked. So not even their clothes would get in the way. Let us lay aside every weight. And not just the things that weigh us down, but let's lay aside the sin that so easily ensnares us, the besetting sin. And run with endurance the race set before us. This is a brand new year, 2023, my goodness. We're living through a period of time that we all agree this is a tumultuous time. We haven't seen anything like this in a generation. This is a very tumultuous time in history. There's a lot of death and dying all around us. A lot of misgivings and ill-givings and conspiracies, and truth can't be found, and everything seems to be falling apart around us. We come now to the beginning of a brand new year, and we want to settle our hearts. And we want to reset our hearts and set our minds. This is the time of the year when we think about life and we make resolutions and we want to resolve how we're going to live this life over the next year. Resolutions. They last about till the end of January, right? I like the guy, he said, I usually skip the gym the first week of the new year. He says, I can't stand the crowd. Everybody's at the gym the first week of the new year. Says I just skip the first week, and then after that, things calm down because things are back to normal. How do we resolve? How do we set our hearts? How do we set our minds? I like James Sherman. His quote, he says, though you can't go back and start again, my friend, you can start from now and make a brand new end. You can start from now and make a brand new end. And by the way, I mentioned Stephen Covey, The 7 Habits, when I began. So let me go back to that. For those of you who have not read Covey's book, for your information, here are the 7 habits. And he chooses the word habits very, very carefully, very, very intentionally. You heard the old saying, sow a thought, you reap an action. Sow an action, you reap a habit. Sow a habit, you reap a character. Sow a character, you reap a destiny. Brothers and sisters, our destiny is tied directly to our thoughts, which are manifested in our actions, which play out in habits, lived out in character, and eventually form our destiny. So we need to be effective. And Stephen Covey gives us the 7 habits. And this is based on research, by the way. He didn't just sit down and write this up. He did some research, and based on the research, here are the 7 characteristics, the things that people habitually do who are most effective in life. Habit 1, be proactive. Resolved. Don't let life happen to you. Be proactive. Habit 2, begin with the end in mind. Begin with the end in mind. Have a clear mental picture of your goal, where you want to go, how you want life to turn out, and live your life in that direction. Habit 3, put first things first. This is the principle of prioritization. First things first. The order of priorities. Seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and everything else will fall into place. Habit number 4, think win-win. Think win-win. So many of us in our relationships, we think win-lose. You lose, I win every time, right? Covey said, no. Our lives would be completely revolutionized if in every conflict situation, instead of thinking, I win, you lose, we think win-win. You win, I win. How can we collaborate so that we both win? We both end up standing. Habit number 5, seek first to understand, then to be understood. Seek first to understand, then to be understood. How often do we want to be understood before we even think of understanding what the other person is saying? Habit 6, one word, synergize. Synergize. This is the principle of creative cooperation. Synergize, synergy. We're walking, we're synergistic in our human relationships. And then finally, number 7, habit 7. I love habit 7. And I've often spoken on it. It's sharpen the saw. Sharpen the saw. If you're going to do something valuable, you need a tool. You need a saw. And you can't get anything done with a dull, broken saw. You got to stop and sharpen the saw. This is the principle of balance and self-renewal. Because I only have one life out of which to live my life. I only have one body with which to serve the Lord. The Apostle Paul says, I beseech you therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your what? Your bodies. Well, if you don't have a body, you're not going to do that. You have one body with which to serve the Lord. Take care of your body. Rest. Do Shabbat. We are Sabbath keepers who tend not to rest on the Sabbath. Do Shabbat regularly. This past Thursday evening, I led a a meeting of our Zone 1, the International Congress's Zone 1, the Caribbean region. Guys from Jamaica and Trinidad and different countries come together the first Thursday evening of every other month. And we do a leadership lesson. And this past Thursday evening, the leadership lesson that I gave, Brother John was on the platform. The leadership lesson was on the life of Caleb. Anybody remember Caleb? Caleb, at age 85, Joshua is now old. Moses is dead. Joshua is now old. Joshua is distributing the land to the people, to the different tribes. And when they get to Caleb's tribe, Caleb speaks up and he says, "Give me this mountain." What mountain? The mountain where the Anakims live. Who are the Anakims? The giants. How old is Caleb? 85. What's an 85-year-old man asking for the mountain where the giants are? Caleb said, "I am now 85 years old, and I am strong today. I'm as strong today as I was 40 years ago when Moses sent us across the Jordan." Wow. Quit talking about how old you are. And that includes the preacher who often talks about how old he is. Caleb, as I shared on Thursday evening, Caleb was who he was because he was passionate about life, because he was excited about the future. Are you excited about the future? I mentioned Elder Calvin Burrell, who used to say, "Be careful how you speak about the future, because your grandkids are going to have to live in it." Caleb was passionate about life. He was excited about the future, but listen, Caleb took care of himself physically and emotionally. It's the only way you can, at 85, say, "I was as strong today as I was when I was 40. He took care of himself physically. One of the things that we resolve in the new year is how we're going to take care of ourselves physically. How we're going to walk this year, how we're going to diet this year, how we're going to, we're going to do all these things. We're going to exercise and be healthy this year. And lo and behold, come February and March and April, and it just kind of falls by the wayside. But we have only one body with which to serve the Lord. And God help us, we must take care of it. I have some weight around the tummy I need to get rid of. How about you? I have some walking I need to do. I have some exercises, some mental exercises, some emotional issues I need to deal with in my own life. We only have one body with which to serve the Lord. And Caleb was able to say, "Give me this mountain." And the question for us today is, what mountain stands in your way that you need to stand up and say, "Oh God, give me that mountain"? What mountain, what obstacle, what challenge, what issue stands before you? And you need to say, "Lord, I'm not going to focus on the obstacle of it. I'm going to focus on the opportunity of it. I'm going to focus on, because you are God and nothing is impossible with you. Give me that mountain." Are you passionate about life? Are you willing to get up off of the couch? Are you willing to go walk across the room, walk across the road? Are you taking care of yourself physically, emotionally? And Thursday evening, I mentioned toward the end, I said, when we talk about taking care of yourself physically, I think of Calvin Burrow because he was the quintessential among us, at least. We all, over the years, he was just a guy that was very health conscious, what he ate. From the time I lived in his home in my early 20s, I've always known him all the years at the conference office, almost 20 years. This guy never ate lunch. He fasted every day, fasted lunch, seldom ate lunch. He climbed all the 54 peaks of the Colorado Rockies from Wyoming to New Mexico. This was a guy that he grew up in a home where they had the first health food store in Oklahoma, in that area, in the Fairview, Oklahoma area, where his parents opened a health food store back in the 50s or 60s. And so he grew up with this sense of health consciousness and lived that out in a beautiful way. And look, my goodness, we can do all the exercises we want and live as healthy as we want. We still will not be able to stop cancer from ravaging our bodies. Who would have thought Calvin Burrow would die of cancer? You see, we can't stop the cancer. We live in a fallen world. And cancer happens to the best of us. We live with the effects of the fall. We all age. And death comes to us eventually. That's the reality that we face. And some of us are closer there than others. But the beautiful good news of the Bible is that we can live our lives for what matters most. We can live for what goes beyond this life. For if we were in this life only, and if we were in this body only, that we had hope, we would be men most miserable. But thank God, our hope goes beyond this life. For our light affliction, Paul says, the things that beset us now, the troubles that we're dealing with now, the trials that are in our lives now, our light affliction are momentary. And they're not to be compared to the far exceeding weight of glory that awaits us. So we look not on the things that are seen, but on the things that are not seen, because the things that are seen are temporal, but the things that we can't see are what? Eternal. Eternal. While the outward man is perishing, the inner man is being renewed day by day, day by day. Here's the irony of it all. The irony of ironies. We will finish well by looking at the end, begin with the end in mind. But while we're looking at the end and keeping the end in mind, we must live in the now. We must live life now. We must live in this moment. We must lean in the moment. If somebody says that some of us are so heavenly minded, we're no earthly good. We need to live in the now, even as we keep the end in mind. In this moment. It reminds me of a beautiful song that Jeremy Camp wrote as he, an old church father, Irenaeus, he said that the glory of God is man fully alive. And Jeremy Camp wrote a song, Keep Me in the Moment. Show me what matters. I don't want to miss what you have for me. I'm thinking about life. Jesus, keep me in this moment. Help me lean into the moment, despite what is happening around me. And as we live in the moment, and the way we live in the moment, the Latin phrase is called coram Deo, coram Deo. We talk about the Imago Dei and the Missio Dei, the image of God, the mission of God. But there's also the Coram Deo. And Coram Deo simply means before the face of God. I live my life. As I live my life, I live it before the face of God. Adam and Eve in the garden, when they ate of the fruit and God came down, what were they doing? They were hiding from the face of God because they knew they had messed up and they had done wrong. When God said, Adam, where are you? He wasn't asking for information because he knew where they were. He knew where he was. He was asking for introspection. He wanted to think about where he was. And Adam's downfall is that he never learned how to live before the face of God, open face before God. Adam made himself a cover, and a cover for Eve. And religious people have always been covering. And we cover so well because I don't want you to know that I'm not doing so well. Because if you know, I'll be embarrassed, I'll be ashamed. But you know, we are supposed to live our lives open-faced before God. And when you are open-faced before God, and you're open-faced before God, and I am too, and we all are doing life together, it is amazing what God does through us. I'm told that in one of the ancient Olympic Games, there was a particular race in which the prize was given not to the runner who got to the finish line first, but to the runner who got to the finish line with his torch still lit. His torch still lit. That's it, isn't it? To come to the end of my journey with my torch still lit, with my testimony still in place, intact. My testimony is still strong. My integrity still intact, finishing well. That's the goal, by the grace of God. And so I conclude today by just reminding you what I said to the leaders on that platform on Thursday evening. It's a quote from Dallas Willard. You know, God did a lot to save us through Jesus Christ. And what does God get out of the deal? What God gets out of the deal, God gets the person that we become, the person we become. Every day we're becoming something. Every day in 2023, we will be becoming something. And what God gets out of the deal is the person we become. So let's become the best version of ourselves. Because we are God's workmanship, God's poema, God's trophy, God's masterpiece. And he wants to put it on display. Let's give him all that we have. By God's grace, in Jesus' name, amen.